Hey everyone, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. So today we're going to take a look at the PiBoy DMG. This device first came out last summer and it got a lot of great reviews from YouTubers and other reviewers, and it immediately sold out across the country. And ever since then, there's been a long wait time for getting one of these. Thankfully, some of the supply is now meeting up with the demand, and so it's a little bit easier to get one now. It's only about a 1 or 2 week wait. And I got mine a couple weeks ago, and I've been playing with it ever since, and so today I'm going to do a deep dive review on all the little things about this device to help you decide whether or not this is something you want to pick up yourself. There are a lot of good things about this device, for example the amount of power that it has. It runs an entire Raspberry 4B inside, but there are also some things I don't like about this device. And so my hope today here is to give you an impression beyond what you would find on some website and really dive into the details. So this is going to be a fairly long review, so grab a cup of coffee or your favorite adult beverage and let's just dive in. Okay, let's start with the stats. This thing runs a Raspberry Pi 4B. You can also run a Raspberry Pi 3 or a Raspberry Pi Zero, but I'm not sure you're going to want to do that for this device. The Pi 4 is a well-known chipset, so I'm not going to go into details here, but it is definitely more powerful than a lot of the chipsets that you find on devices today, like the RG351 devices or things like that. Now, just like the Raspberry Pi, this has upgradable RAM options, so you have the 2GB, 4GB, or 8GB options. I got the 4GB option because I'm not really sure that 8GB is really going to push emulation that much further. By that point, you're limited by the CPU and GPU. This has a 3.5-inch LCD display with a 640 by 480 resolution running at a 4:3 aspect ratio. It also has a mini HDMI port out, so you could use this like any other Raspberry Pi device and plug it into your TV and use it like that too. And some of the other native features within the Raspberry Pi 4, it has a 2.4 or 5 GHz Wi-Fi connection, Bluetooth 5.0, Gigabit Ethernet, and a total of 4 different USB ports. 2 of them are 3.0, the other 2 are 2.0. Which means that you could use this device for multiplayer gaming as well. It also has a series of dedicated ports that are unique to it, so for example a headphone jack, volume wheel, and then an LCD brightness wheel for the display itself. And probably one of the unique things about this device is that it has the exact same shape and size of the original Game Boy. Now it has 6 face buttons, so you can see them, they're labeled as Z, Y, X, C, B, A, and then they also have L and R buttons in the back. The D-pad is almost exactly like the original Game Boy, and it has a single switch-style analog stick and a mono speaker. Inside it has a 4500 mAh battery, which gives you about 3 hours of playtime, but you can squeeze 4 hours of playtime into it if you're using only 2D games. But in general, the battery life I would expect to be about 3 hours. So there are 3 different versions sold on Experimental Pi's website. The first one is called the base kit. That one you need to bring your own Raspberry Pi as well as your power supply and battery. The full kit has everything but the Raspberry Pi itself, and then the assembled kit has everything inside of it, including the Raspberry Pi. Now this is the one I went with. It starts at $190, but I upgraded to the 4 gigs of RAM, so it came out to $220 altogether. So obviously that's pretty pricey, and it's about double the price of some other devices, and we'll get into that later. You're not stuck with this original coloring. You can actually buy different shells as well as different buttons to tailor the device to you. Honestly, I think that a clear device and maybe some colored buttons would really add a lot of uniqueness to your device. Okay, let's go ahead and do a quick unboxing here. Now the device took about 2 weeks to get to me from the time that I ordered it to the time that it showed up on my doorstep. I paid about $15 for shipping altogether to here in Hawaii. I have to say I really do like this box. It's unique looking and just has a lot of care put into it, something you don't usually see with a lot of those Chinese handhelds. Inside you'll find a bag with spare parts. A lot of that has to do with the different Raspberry Pi devices that are supported in the case. It also has a micro USB charger and then a wall plug, as well as a carrying case. Okay, so moment of truth here. Man, this thing feels big. It's like holding a time capsule. This thing is the exact same size as the original Game Boy, for better or for worse. Some people really like the chunkiness of this thing, and it works really well because you're able to fit a Raspberry Pi inside of it, but I remain a little bit skeptical about this. This thing is really, really big. I do think it's very impressive that they were able to put in all of these new features into this original style. So for example, they were able to fit a perfectly sized battery inside, and obviously the Raspberry Pi as well. So it's just kind of this crazy mixture of old school feel as well as this new school technology. First impressions when it comes to the buttons and everything else, they feel very authentic. The D-pad and everything else feels exactly like the original Game Boy. The device has this nice textured plastic to it. It's just the right amount of grit to make it feel solid in your hands. And these are those back buttons I was talking about, left and right shoulder buttons. And these can be replaced with bigger buttons. We'll do that here in a second. It comes with a generic micro SD card with 64 gigabytes and no games loaded, so you have to load all the games yourself. But luckily, at least the firmware is flashed onto the card. Here's the mini HDMI port. And then up top you can see you have the power switch, 4 USB connections, and then the gigabit Ethernet. On the right side you have your LCD brightness wheel, which I think is very handy. And then on the bottom you have a volume wheel, a headphone jack, and a micro USB charging port. I wish it was USB-C like the original Pi itself. Now the lettering on these buttons is just kind of weird to me. I just want to read it ABC and XYZ, but as you can see here they went the backwards route. So it makes it kind of confusing for things like Sega Genesis. So the battery comes inside the case, but it's not plugged in, so you have to plug it in yourself. Not a big deal, but then you just go ahead and install it yourself. Let's go ahead and boot it up and show you the boot up time. Now this is important because the Raspberry Pi itself is not able to do sleep mode. So this device is something you're going to have to power off and power on often. And make sure that even when you do the software shutdown, you still need to flip the switch itself, because if you have it turned on, the switch is on, but you've powered down the system, if you push any button, it'll turn on the system again. It's kind of annoying. But as you can see here, it takes about 30 seconds exactly to start up. Okay, let's do some size comparisons with other devices here. It's probably not being conveyed very well in this video, but this thing is thick. Easily the biggest device that I own. If you really want that old school nostalgic feel, this is going to be a good fit. But just like it was back in the 90s, this thing is not very ergonomic. For example, I can never figure out where to put my hands. So I often will lace my fingers in the back like that. But if you try to hold your fingers apart so that they're not having to touch, it just feels kind of weird in the hands and I almost feel like I'm going to drop it. So in a size comparison, here is the Powkiddy A19. This is like a Retroid Pocket 1 ripoff. And you can see it's much smaller, but even worse when it comes to ergonomics because this thing is basically just a brick. But it's about half the thickness of a PiBoy DMG. Same thing with RG351P here, it's about half that same thickness. Now another vertical device like the Powkiddy RGB2 seems much smaller and more compact. And then also a lot thinner as well, about the same thickness as the Retroid Pocket 1. And you can see here, here's a direct comparison of the thickness sizes. So maybe not half the thickness, but still significantly less. And it just dwarfs the RG280V. Okay, let's talk buttons and D-pad. So both of these are fairly flush with the device. They are not very prominent, and they have a very mushy feel to it. The D-pad in particular is very hard to push down on. You have to really mash on it. The face buttons themselves are a lot like the Super Nintendo controllers, the bottom two buttons on the original SNES pad. I like that they're nice and large, and they have a fair amount of clickiness to them, but because they are so inset into the device, it doesn't have a lot of spring to them. If you look at the RG351P, you can see it's just nice and clicky and very responsive. It reminds me more of old school gamepads, so for example, here's the PlayStation 1 gamepad. And same thing, big button, not a lot of travel. And here's the Super Nintendo gamepad, and this has a little bit more travel and a bit more springiness to it, but I'd say this is the closest analogy to the PiBoy DMG. I really don't mind these face buttons, it's just something you have to get used to. Now the start and select buttons are very similar to like these old school buttons that you're used to on older devices. They're very rubbery and mushy, and sometimes you really have to mash on these. A lot like the D-pad, you just have to push down on them really hard. Personally, I'm not a fan of this, but you know, you're not going to push these buttons very often. The D-pad has that same mushiness to it. I really feel like I have to pound down on this thing in order to move it across. But once you get used to kind of that feel of that, I think it's not the end of the world, but it's definitely something that I think is inferior to other devices. The analog stick, it is what it is. I don't think there's anything bad about it, but it does stick out quite a bit. And it can get in your way if you have bigger hands when you're trying to use the D-pad. So on the back, you can see I upgraded to the other buttons that are available with the spare parts. I like these a lot better because they're easier to see and they stick out just a bit more, which makes them easier to push down. So I would recommend upgrading these, and I'll do a separate video on how to swap these out. Now there's a fan inside of this Raspberry Pi 4 in order to keep it cool. I'm going to show you what it sounds like at max speed when you first turn it on. It's not going to always be like this, but I want to give you a good indication. So definitely not a silent device, and the fan speed's going to change depending on what kind of load you put on it. Okay, here's a quick weight comparison. This is 332 grams. That is significantly heavier than any other device that I own. Let me give you a comparison here. Here's the RG351P, which is about 190 grams altogether. So not quite half the weight, but still a lot less. Same thing with the RG351M, which is a metal device. It's only 271 grams, or the Odra Go Super with a 5-inch screen is only 277. Again, that 332 is a significant heft. It's a good and a bad thing. So this device has some pretty bad light bleeding, especially from the top LED. So you can see here in a darkened condition, it's just crazy. Now the LED brightness is actually set at 100 initially, but I'll show you how to change that here in a second. But as you can imagine, playing this in the dark with 100% brightness like this is just a pain in the butt. Even playing it in the light is pretty bad. But it's a very quick fix to change it to something lower. As you can see here, this is only with 2% brightness, and this is what I use. And that LCD brightness wheel is very handy because you're able to just turn the brightness down right then and there, so this is actually a nice device to play in the dark. Okay, to swap out the LCD brightness, you just plug the SD card into your device, and on that boot partition, you're going to find a file called osd.cfg. So all you have to do is open that up with a text editor, and you're going to find all sorts of options in here. And near the top, you're going to see maximum brightness settings for the red and the green LED light. So all I do is just change those to 2. Now it's still going to be 100% brightness when you're like charging it when the power is off, but when you're actually playing the device, all the brightness will be much lower. Now there's some fan speed things in here, I'm not even going to mess with those. But below that, you can see which statistics data you can have showing on your screen at all times. And a lot of these are already preset. Personally, I don't need to see things like the temperature or the voltage or the current or anything else like that because I'm not going to overclock this system, I'm just using it as is. So all you have to do is just add hashes to the things you don't want to see. In general, I turned off everything except for the battery indicator. Once you've got it configured the way you want, just go ahead and save the text file, and that's it. Eject the SD card and put it back into your device. Now when you first boot it up, it's not going to have any games on it, and you can't load them directly onto the SD card. You have to do this via FTP. So let me show you how to do that real quick. So on the device itself, go into the RetroPie settings, and then there's going to be a setting near the bottom that says Show IP. Just go ahead and click on that, and you'll get a window that pops up, and the first thing there is your IP address. So just go ahead and make a note of that. Then you're going to need to use an FTP client like WinSCP. And then you start a new session. And then under hostname, you just type in the IP address you were just looking at. The username is going to be Pi, P-I, and the password is going to be Raspberry, all lowercase. And there you go, now you're inside. So just go into the RetroPie folder, and here you can add all your BIOS files, as well as all your ROMs. And this is a typical emulation station and RetroArch setup, so you're just going to throw all your BIOS files into that folder, and then put all of your ROMs into each of the specific system files. So here's what it looks like when it's fully loaded up. I also went and changed the theme, which is very easy to do in the RetroPie settings. So because this has Wi-Fi, you can go ahead and scrape all the box art and everything else like that, so this is what it'll look like when you're navigating the systems. When you first start up a game, it's going to give you a real quick splash screen. And in that splash screen, if you hit the A button, that'll give you all the settings. You can set your RetroArch cores, you can change your emulators, all those kind of things are done at that time. So one nice thing about the volume wheel is that as you change it, it actually gives you an on-screen indicator. That's really handy. Okay, so let's talk screen now. So this LCD panel is not OCA laminated, which means there's a space between the glass and the panel itself. And it is significant. It's probably some of the biggest I've ever seen in terms of gaps, which is bad for a couple reasons. One, that means that dust may get collected inside the device. Two, it gives it a lot of glare. And then three, it just feels very inset into the device. It doesn't have that immediate kind of presence that an OCA laminated screen gives you. It more feels like you're looking down into the device to look at the LCD display. Now when you get into gameplay, one of the things that may be disorienting is the actual button mapping. This 6-button layout is kind of disorienting for everything but Sega Genesis games. So for example, on Super Nintendo, it's going to be these 4 buttons to the right. But if you look at the Super Nintendo controller, the layout is not the same. It's more of like a cross pattern. So say you're pushing Y button to run and then the B button to jump, your thumb is going to be at an angle, which is very ergonomic as you're holding the controller. It just feels very natural. But as you're holding the PiBoy DMG, your thumb actually has to be straight up and down, which means you have to like hold your shoulder near your side, which gives you just kind of this weird unnatural feeling. Look at the Super Nintendo controller and how ergonomic it looks as you're holding it in your hands. It's not the same experience with the PiBoy DMG. And you're likely going to get used to this over time, but when I started initially playing it, it was very disorienting to me. And using the analog stick, it seems like even more of a mismatch, just in your ergonomics. So beyond the glare, there are other issues with the LCD panel. So for example, there's this little dot of brightness that I have on my device, and then the entire left side has a lot of light bleeding. And it's really apparent when you're playing this in the dark. Now this 6-button layout is actually to your advantage in some games, for example with Street Fighter, because this is how the original layout was. But unfortunately, the buttons are not mapped correctly out of the gate. For example, the shoulder buttons are the heavy punch and heavy kick buttons, so you're going to have to go and map them yourself. So you just hit select and X to get into RetroArch, and then you're going to go into controls, and then adjust your port 1 controls and remap the buttons. You can then save the game remap file, so that way it works every time you boot up this game. Now if you start up another Capcom game, for example X-Men vs Street Fighter, you can go in and load the same Super Street Fighter remap file, and then save it as your own game remap file, and then it's going to work for that one as well. So you just have to do that one time for each of these games. But any of these fighting games, once they're remapped, they work really well. It does take a while to get used to this mushy D-pad, but I think you'll adjust to it. Now Game Boy is also not configured right out of the gate, so if you go into the options section, you can change things like colorization and motion blur and things like that so that it feels a lot like an original Game Boy. And I have a dedicated handheld guide here on my channel, which you can just go and check out to learn how to do all of these things. But as you can see while I'm playing, that bright white spot that I have on the top left of my device is really prominent while you're playing too. Unfortunately, I think it's a quality control thing with the LCD panel itself. Okay, let's move on to game performance here. I'm going to use the HDMI out so that way you can see the entire screen here. Now the main thing that people talk about with this device is how well it runs Dreamcast, because it's running the ReDream emulator, which isn't available on most of those handheld devices that you have out in the market. And yeah, I got to admit, it's incredible. I don't know how to show the frames per second on ReDream, but you can see here that everything is running nice and smooth. Not every single game is perfect, but most of them are. Even games that are really hard to run, like Ikaruga, run just great. By far, this is the best Dreamcast performance I've ever seen. Now, it's not perfect, so for example with NBA 2K1 here, there's significant slowdown and the audio has also got stuttering issues. And you're kind of stuck with these old school Dreamcast controls. So for example with Quake 3 Arena, you actually use the face buttons to move your character, and it's really disorienting to use. But you know, that's how it was in the 90s. So games like Rez, which are also hard to emulate, work just great on this device. But racing games like San Francisco Rush, they run really well. It does have some audio stuttering issues, and then every once in a while you'll see some graphical lags, but it's not too bad. Other games like Sega GT run nice and smooth. I do think we're probably getting a tiny bit of drop in frames per second, but it's not that significant. Games that usually will chug on other systems, like for example House of Dead 2, runs really well. And then thankfully Unreal Tournament uses the actual D-pad to control everything. Again, you're only using single stick gameplay, but it's not too bad. And probably one of the hardest games to emulate, Virtua Fighter 3 here, is nice and smooth. Same thing with Virtua Tennis 2. So yeah, in general, if you really like Dreamcast, this is going to be probably the best handheld system you can buy today. Arcade emulation is also very impressive. Some games that are notoriously hard to emulate, for example Killer Instinct, run at basically a playable speed. It's definitely degraded, so it's not 100%, but I would say it's at least 90% full speed. Other games like NBA Hang Time run at full speed. And obviously all of the lower end arcade games are going to play beautifully as well. I'm really just showing some of the higher end ones which do have a lot of issues when it comes to emulation. Ninja Baseball Batman is just perfect. And even Street Fighter the movie works well. And this is a terrible game, but I love it so much. They tried so desperately to make a game that looked like Mortal Kombat. Okay, Nintendo 64 performance is a mixed bag. It really depends on what emulator you're using, and there's about 7 available to you. As you can see here, the default emulator here on Cruisin' USA does not play well. It's got this weird stuttering to it. But if you switch over to a different emulator here on RetroArch, you're not going to get any of those graphical glitches, but it is going to have some slowdown. And the initial RetroArch resolution for Nintendo 64 is 320 by 240, so you have to go into the settings and up it to 640 by 480. But all the same, games like F-Zero X play just fine. It takes a little bit of work to figure out which emulator works best for each game, but once you have it locked in, you can just go ahead and set those settings, and then you'll never have to worry about it again. So there's a lot of potential for good Nintendo 64 gameplay as long as you do a little bit of your homework. Just don't expect miracles. For example, Mario Tennis, I can get it to run fairly quickly, but it has a lot of those graphical glitches that you found in Cruisin' USA. Same thing with Wave Race, I had to play at a low resolution in order to make sure it had smooth gameplay. So Nintendo 64 is kind of a mixed bag. Okay, moving on to PlayStation Portable. This runs the standalone PPSSPP emulator. And in general, those games that are almost impossible to play on other devices play fairly well using a frame skip of 1. You're definitely still going to have some slowdown on games like God of War, but it's pretty impressive how well they play on this. Same thing with Outrun 2006. With a 1x resolution and with a frame skip of 1, you can basically play it at 100% speed. And I'm really just showing off the hard to emulate games because the lower ones are easy to play. You can see here with Liberty City Stories, with a frame skip of 1, you still have some fairly smooth gameplay. And even though it looks low resolution here on your screen, when you're playing it on a 3.5-inch display on the device itself, it doesn't look so bad. Now I know a lot of people were excited to play Sega Saturn games on this device, but unfortunately there's only one emulator available, it's a RetroArch Core, and it doesn't play very well. You can see here it's capping out at about 42 frames per second. Definitely the best you can find on a handheld device, but still not very good. You can see games like Virtua Fighter here are just glitching out. I'm pretty amazed that one punch will kick Jackie right out of the ring. I don't think that's supposed to happen. And some of those games that I really want to play on the Saturn just are not playable. So for example, Nights into Dreams only runs at about 40-41 frames per second. Other games like Sonic R don't even boot, they just get stuck on the title screen. Okay, let's start breaking it down to what I like and what I don't like. We'll start with what I like. Number 1, this thing fills me with nostalgia. It has that perfect shape and size of the original Game Boy. But inside it has that Raspberry Pi 4. It's a very powerful machine. Basically any of the lower end systems are going to play perfectly, and you can even push it to the max when it comes to some of those higher end systems. It has a 640 by 480 display, 3.5 inches with a 4:3 aspect ratio, which makes it perfect for classic gaming. I also like the RetroPie and Emulation Station front end, and that it mostly uses RetroArch as the back end. If you've done any sort of emulation with any other device, this is going to be very familiar to you. And like we saw earlier in the video, Dreamcast performance is just out of sight here. This is by far the best Dreamcast portable device that I've used today. I also like that it has all the functions of a regular Raspberry Pi 4. So it has the HDMI out, it has the 4 USB ports, as well as Wi-Fi and Bluetooth. So you can do things like Steam Link on this, you could hook it up to your TV, you could use it like a regular old Raspberry Pi that also happens to be a portable Raspberry Pi device as well. Overall, I think this is a really neat concept. I like the mix of the old school and the new school. I like the fact that it can be used just as any other Raspberry Pi as a standalone device hooked up to your TV or your monitor, but you can also use it as a portable gaming handheld. It's very obvious that the people behind PiBoy spent a lot of time and deliberation in getting this thing just right for them. Okay, but like with any device, there are some negatives, so let's talk about what I don't like. Number 1, even though it has that Game Boy shape and size, I think it's rather dated. It does give you a lot of nostalgia, but sometimes that's not a very good fit for this day and age. For example, that old school D-pad just doesn't compare to things like on the RG351 devices. The start and select are also very rubbery and hard to push down on. And in general, the button layout is just not great for ergonomics. I find myself turning on a game and then trying to figure out which button does what because none of it feels very intuitive. But there are some dings when it comes to craftsmanship. For example, the light bleeding on that LED light at the top right. And then I personally had some poor quality with my LCD panel. I had a lot of light bleeding on the left. I had that weird dot that keeps showing up every time I play a game. There's just a lot of blooming that's happening on the sides of the LCD display. On top of that, I really wish it was OCA laminated because this screen pales in comparison to something like on the RG350M. And these are shortcomings based on Raspberry Pi, but it has no Nintendo DS emulation, and then it has no sleep mode either. And I understand it, PiBoy doesn't have the ability to change those things, but it's just unfortunate. And because there's so much power going on and there's a fan inside and everything else, the battery life is not great. I would expect 2 to 3 hours altogether if you're going to be playing 3D games. You can push it to 4 hours if you're only going to play like Game Boy games and stuff like that, but that's not what this device is built for. It has so much power that you're going to want to play those higher end systems. For anything lower, it's going to be overkill. And then my last note is that it has a fairly high cost in terms of the performance. Yes, it can play Dreamcast better than other devices. The arcade emulation is probably the best I've ever seen on a portable device. But it's going to be on you to decide, is that worth that extra cost, $220 for the 4GB model like I have here, as well as dealing with some of the missteps that I'm highlighting here. And foremost among them is the D-pad itself, as well as the ergonomics of the device. I feel like those are definitely compromises when you're holding the device in your hands. So in summary, I think the PiBoy DMG is just a bit of overkill. It's a very powerful machine that is held back by some of its other components, for example the LCD panel, the ergonomics, and the D-pad. Alternatively, something like the RG350M is underkill, because it has such a high quality build to it, but it's very underpowered. You have your dual analog sticks, you have really great D-pad and face buttons, you have pretty good shoulder buttons, HDMI out and USB-C charging, everything else. It's a very beautiful device, but unfortunately it's held back by the user interface and the power of the chipset. It's just not as fun to navigate and play through as it is with anything that can run Emulation Station. And it just goes to show that every device has its own ups and downs and compromises here and there. You know, the display on the 350M just cannot be beat, but unfortunately it just can't play all the games that the PiBoy DMG can play. Alternatively, the PiBoy DMG can play everything, but it's not as fun to use. What I hope is that we're going to find something that goes in the middle, that has all the power of the PiBoy DMG, but all of the elegant craftsmanship that you can find in the 350M. And we're just not there yet. Every single device has a little bit of compromise to it, and the PiBoy DMG is no different. So at the end of the day, do I recommend this device for you? I think that if you're really into Dreamcast, this is a no-brainer. I think you're going to really enjoy it. And if you happen to have a soft spot for the original Game Boy case, then I'm going to say, yeah, this is probably a good device for you. Dreamcast and Game Boy lovers are going to love this. But for everyone else, someone who's looking for the perfect emulation device, this unfortunately is not it. And I could probably give it a better recommendation if it was at a lower price, but given that it was $220 before shipping for this device for me, I just don't think there's enough to it to warrant that extra cost. There's too many things I don't like about this device to give it a resounding recommendation. Alright everyone, that's it for this video. I hope you enjoyed it. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful. We will see you next time. Happy gaming.